Good evening again, and welcome everyone back to FractalU.com. We've had such an overwhelming response to our courses and conversations, Fractal U, and one of our favorite presenters and participants in this drama and fun has been Professor Teresa Burns, who's with us this evening. Welcome, Terry. Thanks for coming back to us.
Hi, thanks for having me.
And boy, do we have fun planned for tonight. The title of tonight's talk, as you see here, is called Seeking the Stone. So the outline here was that, first of all, Terry is going to be releasing her new book. It's actually a book by Vincent Bridges, which Terry has been extremely instrumental in editing and bringing forward. It's called An Alchemical Enigma, A Short History of the Rise and Fall of Sir Edward Kelley by Vincent Bridges, editor Terry Burns, and her partners, Alishka, right?
Yeah, Alishka Bridges, and then Alan Moore, who a lot of you know, has been helping edit with the graphics. Jeffrey Cooperman, who used to edit the Journal of the Western Mystery Tradition. And some of you have seen the animated graphic from Amy Lionheart. So
yes,
it's finally done.
He redid the original painting of Sir Edward Kelley, supposedly in the tower, I believe. And so it's a wonderful new image for the book you saw in the promo here. And so the subtitle here was A Western History of Alchemy Derived from J. Weidner and Vincent Bridges. This is by Terry writing this. Mysteries of the Cross of Hendaye, and some comments on the metaphysics of past lives with digressions onto sacred languages, standing waves, and group karma, in which Dan explains...
You wrote that part, Dan.
Dan explains why understanding principles of alchemy is the best way to undo the massive group karma of the First Crusade. And then later, Terry added a thought to be discussed a bit this evening. Why did the angels tell Dee and Kelley that the great table of earth held the key to alchemical transmutations?
Ta-da! So, we will tell you right here.
Cool. So, boy, do we have fun planned for you guys tonight. Now, the general plan for this evening, as usual, is that I'm going to do a first sort of 5 to 7 minute warm-up here and outline what I think are some of the high points and the fun parts here. And then I'm basically going to turn it over to Teresa, and we're going to use her outline and slides, and I will just come in occasionally to add a few fun comments when appropriate. So, intro and outline from Dan Winter. That's me. There's two parts of this I would like to introduce. You know that I was grateful to be a very good friend to Vincent Bridges, along with many of us for many years. And Vincent's karma has come to be the subject of so much discussion. The local color has interest to all of us. And as we tell these stories, remember, we're telling them with compassion for a friend. But one part of that karma, which we're going to be talking about tonight, is after, famously, most of you know this part of the story, with Roger Green's help, we brought Vincent Bridges to Prague for the first time. Of course, he had many, obviously, past life memories there. And when he arrived there the first night, instead of using the hotel room, we're not sure about getting alcohol, but we know that he instead went to the graveyard to spend the night with his old friends in Prague. So that was my introduction.
Vincent didn't drink, actually, so I don't think alcohol had anything to do with it.
Yeah, but it obviously was true that he found old buddies in the grave. That's just a echo.
How did that echo happen?
No, it's okay. It's somebody came in with a phone connection, and we just dampened that mic. It's okay. So, and what Vincent said, that in the next days we were actually deep in the boat on the river through Prague there, and Vincent was starting to tell his more colorful stories, and his most famous story, which Terry will add a bit to tonight, was that the way he became cursed to have so many past life memories that would not go away, and those lives apparently included memories of Kelley with Dee, and probably of Flamel and Crowley and others. Was it Cagliostro also?
I believe so, yeah.
So depending on who you talk to, but the accuracy of Vincent's memories of those lives was breathtaking. I mean, I personally was in a museum with him in Torino when he interrupted the tour guide to talk about the Savoy family and who helped the Savoy family get pregnant. Oh my God! And the tour guide was jaw fell to the floor. And so, I mean, I witnessed personally some of his past life memories. So,
Well, Dan, could I just toss something into that? You know, one of the challenges of editing this book was that I knew what Vincent thought about things because we talked about him for years. I mean, we'd Skype and Facebook back and forth. They have hundreds of pages. So it is like in ways, reverse engineering. So like with Kelley, those of you that know that history, he was sure that Francesco Pucci and Albert Lasky and Lasky's wife, who was originally named Sabine Deceive, great name for her, but that they had all known each other in France and before the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. Well, when you have something like that and you're trying to reverse engineer to it, it's kind of bizarre. And fun. I mean, but it's not normal research.
Yeah, the scale of the way Vincent's memories crossed continents when he was with us on our Holy Grail science tours of South France here many times, he couldn't go to the Cathar strongholds because the memories were so strong they would overwhelm him. But anyway, to finish so we were on the bottom of this boat in Prague, and Vincent starts telling us, yes, he found himself on the wrong side of the Crusades, namely with the Christians, murdering Jews and Muslims up to his waist in blood in the First Crusade, and some rabbi grabs his saddle and supposedly cursed him that he would not be able to forget anything until, and maybe I didn't get the words right here, Terry, but until basically the end of the Catholic Church. I think that's the way I read that.
I think he said a thousand years, but yeah, that's and think of that, Dan, since you do such a good explanation of karma with somebody who is focused enough to keep their memories so on. That would seem to say that, you know, that rabbi is around somewhere if he's.
Yeah, and the nature of that, and why it is a curse to not be able to forget, and that's a whole other story. But and hopefully Terry will tell more of that story. The next piece of that story that I wanted to mention this evening is where that leads up to the physics of alchemy, which has been my passion for so many years. And I remember quizzing Vincent so many times. Well, wait, there was one more piece of that story that I was supposed to tell first, and that is, if you zoom forward many lifetimes, remember that we get to the lifetime of Kelley and Dee in the time of Shakespeare and King Rudolph in Prague. And the reason I bring this up is, remember that the speaker that was intended for tonight, Alan Green, tobeornotttobe.org, has hundreds, if not thousands, of pages of detailed, rather academic evidence that Dee was in fact the wizard of the physics behind Shakespeare and the story of Shakespeare. And I suggest you check out that tobeornotttobe.org and Alan Green's lovely presentation a year ago here at fractalu.com, and he will be on again in September, but had a medical issue, couldn't be with us this evening. But interestingly, that it was that conversation, first of all, that happened because of Teresa Burns, who so kindly originally introduced us to Alan Green, that we learned that, you know, there is detailed evidence that Dee was doing extremely rigorous geometric physics, including the discovery of how to implement and use longitude and latitude, to the point of the fact that the longitude and latitude of the Great Pyramid was very, very clearly in Shakespeare before longitude and longitude part was ever even known to the other scientists of that age. And so Alan Green presents a lot of evidence that the Dee and Kelley story had everything to do with Shakespeare. Well, this gets us back to Vincent telling his story to us. Vincent is saying that when Dee and Kelley got to Prague and convinced Rudolph to sponsor their alchemy work, that at that time when Queen Elizabeth discovered that Dee and Kelley were having success making gold, and remember shortly around that time, the British Royal Society, the most advanced scientists on the planet at that time, measured the gold that Dee and Kelley made as being the purest gold that had ever been measured on the surface of the planet. So this is I'm talking serious science and history here. This is not a fairy tale per se. And so Queen Elizabeth goes through her closet to find her most clever spy and locates this person named Francis Garland in Dee's notes. Later, we present, and Teresa can talk about this at length if she chooses to, extensive evidence that Francis Garland in John Dee's notes is quite literally Shakespeare. And Shakespeare then is learning about the magician and the sorcerer's apprentice and the whole story, which many have already agreed is John Dee. So the piece of that story that's relevant to the book that Terry is about to talk about, A Short History of the Rise and Fall of Kelley, has to do with the fact that the famous Dark Lady in Shakespeare apparently was quite literally the wife of the leading magistrate in Prague, the first assistant to King Rudolph, who was having a secret love affair with Kelley, whom Shakespeare, as Francis Garland, was also literally in love with. And there was a love competition between Vincent as Kelley versus Shakespeare in that time. And then Kelley ends up having a duel to preserve the honor of the Dark Lady in that time, which was extremely ill-advised, because later, when King Rudolph puts Kelley in jail for having a duel, which was illegal per King Rudolph, it was actually that same Dark Lady that betrayed Kelley. And now, why are we going into this gruesome historical detail? Remember, I'm introducing the book Terry's about to talk about. Well, the short history of the rise and fall, and part of the alchemy here, is that we believe that Vincent quite literally met the reincarnation of that Dark Lady in this life and fell in love with her. And we know that maybe we shouldn't mention names here, but these are friends of ours. We know them very well. And Vincent's heart was about breaking when he was about to reconnect with the Dark Lady in this life that he was in love with the night before he died. And the story gets, my hair stands up even thinking about this, but so Vincent Bridges had moved into Kelley's tower in Prague to write the book about Kelley, and the only part of Vincent's new play called The Donkey and the Cradle, which was to be presented the morning that he died, that was therefore never presented because he died, was the only part of the history of that book that was inaccurate according to our other partners in this, and we can mention names, maybe Logan and others, and our friends in Prague who live in Kelley's tower today in Prague. The only part of the history that he didn't get right was that that in the book Donkey in the Cradle, now Vincent tells the story of Kelley as if the Dark Lady was the hero. And in fact, the ghost of Kelley, living in Kelley's tower today, was so angry at Vincent today, the reincarnation of Kelley, that, believe it or not, that was the day that Kelley died, that Vincent died. Now this, you see, why is this relevant to alchemy? Because remember, there I am quizzing Vincent repeatedly. I mean, dozens of times over many years. I'm saying, Vincent, if Kelley knew how to use that projected powder, remember, it was Vincent who came to me, among others, and explained in detail how the Kaaba stone of the Muslim was documented to have half of its volume ground up during the time when the mad caliph possessed the Kaaba stone, and that, remember, it's a glass meteorite which has a gold vaporized through it, so the foam geometry becomes, the nanobubble becomes self-similar to the phase conjugate geometry of the nano gold in the vaporized gold in the foam bubble, meaning it's a massively broad spectral phase conjugator, so it's capacitively implosive. But of course, the other part of that story, and we have our friend here, Harold, if I may say, is suggesting to us today that this Kaaba stone, which we know is based on golden ratio, and we know that the arrival of the meteor was not just central to the culture of the Kaaba stone and the Muslims, but it's the origin of the Prague story, the Moldavite there. The arrival of the meteorite is the origin of the town my partner is from in Sweden, and the arrival of the meteorite is the beginning of the story of the Serpent Mound in Cahokia, mounds in Ohio, all of which calls the ET supposedly, and has trace minerals which are of immense value, presumably because they are phase conjugate implosive dielectrics. Our friend Harold says that this meteorite, which is called the Eye of Lucifer, carried with it an intent that may have been from some dying planet, perhaps somewhere, and that in the crystal structure was hidden the seed of an intent which unfortunately may have not been the same as the intent of Mother Earth. So there's a whole other complicated story, which I'm only introducing here and passing over this very lightly. But remember, so then when thousands of these Muslims rotate counterclockwise around this implosive capacitance, the glass meteorite, they're creating the alchemic geometry of fusion, but possibly around a crystal geometry which is not yet actually embedded with the Earth itself. And we believe we can understand how to measure that in terms of the harmonic content capacitively. There's a whole story here. So what we are doing when we are seeking the stone, now I'm quoting the slide on Gary's screen here, when we are seeking the stone, effectively, or when we're seeking the principal alchemy, we are ultimately seeking the mechanism of the symmetry of perfect fusion. And I don't mean just non-destructive charge collapse of the isotope transition, perfect transmutation called alchemy. I also quite literally mean the possibility of fusion of people, because it's very appropriate for people to seek bliss and fusion in every religion, including the Islamic tradition, which we honor here, along with a Christian, but we realize that mistakes have been made and we need to see a big picture. And we're always saying that when you see the science, it becomes self-empowering. So seeking the stone means more than just finding the money or the alchemy. So Vincent always told me that Kelley did not tell King Rudolph how to make gold because he didn't believe King Rudolph had pure intention. But what we have learned in retrospect here after studying this history, that the repeated pattern between Flamel and the incarnation of of Vincent S. Kelley, that the pattern was they knew they had some projective red powder, the Philosopher's Stone, but they did not know how to make more. And so they were seeking the stone. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Terry. I hope that was a fun introduction.
That was great. I tell you, I can't top it. I'm going to start asking you questions here. But so here's what I thought. I'm just going to give, I have kind of an outline, but on this outline, for those of you just arriving now, there's some questions that we can go through. What was alchemy before the First Crusade and why? And that's in the West. I mean, there's a whole Chinese history of alchemy too. And how did it become something afterwards? How did it connect to sacred alphabets? But then this third one I don't think is really asked by anyone else. That is, why did he consider Enochian related to alchemy? Now, that's the plan. We don't need to follow the plan. You have questions on something else. This is pretty free floating. As I said, I'm a sub here. My presentation will not be probably near as stylish as the one you saw last week, which was awesome. But here we go. So
I think those questions are great, Terry. I think those are the right questions. And
so Dan has already talked about seeking the stone, but we could say, what do you even mean by the stone? And with a chemical enigma, a short history of the rise and fall of Sir Edward Kelley, that's going to be released in Prague on the 19th. If any of you are going to be there, come to the Donkey in the Cradle. There's the address of the Facebook event page. And so here is the cover of the dust jacket. So I'm going to just pull this over. And what is, I think, of interest to this conversation is, with Sir Edward Kelley, there was a lot of, I think with any kind of writing, to be honest, there's a fair amount of reverse engineering. But with historians looking at Kelley, up until I would say 50 years ago, it was all reverse engineering. That is, you start with the premise that he's a liar, he's a fraud, he tricked Dee, he tricked Rudolph, and he got what he deserved. Well, then you have this amazing record of transformations. I mean, over and firsthand ones. From Sir Edward Dyer, from French alchemist Nicholas Bernard, from John Dee's son Arthur Dee. So then you say, the you being people writing histories on this, well, he tricked them too. Wow, look, he tricked Rudolph. That was pretty good. He tricked Dee. That's so. If you turn it around the other way and say, well, maybe he didn't, then you have a much more interesting question. The problem with this is that we know Kelley lied or misrepresented. And so I think what I'm going to do, since I've learned how to switch slides here.
What you're saying
yeah.
The evidence was clear that he did, in fact, accomplish production of gold, real alchemy.
Yeah, and it's reported by numerous people who don't know each other. And that's any of you, yeah.
The history is clear, yes.
And so one of the things actually in editing this book, it has a problem that things that I deal with often have, which is the footnotes get too long. So the footnotes are about as long as the text because, like, all right, where are some of the examples of this? Anyway, I called up the introduction for this because what I want to do first is go to a conversation that Vincent and I had. This is in 2013. Okay, so because I want to illustrate sort of the problem with dealing with things if your real research is that you think you remember it and you don't know how it happened, but you think you remember it, and no one says this happened, but you're sure it does. Now, complicate it with Vincent, though, you know, he may haunt me for saying this. Vincent could be not terribly straightforward. He could be very manipulative. We'd agreed on several writing projects, and no sooner did he come back from Prague that he was like, yeah, change my mind, tough. I was like, oh, gee, thanks. So you never know what's true, what's misrepresentation. And so I was just going to use one conversation to kind of illustrate that. Plus, it's fun. You're welcome to think of all of this as a good novel, right? Because I ain't on any crusades, and so take it however you'd like. So if you are work with Enochian, you may know the spirit Madimi who shows up, and if you know the so-called wife swapping, it was Madimi that supposedly told Dee and Kelley to do this. Actually told all four of them. But so about 2013, Vincent pops on Facebook and says this to me. So what's your take on the spirit Madimi? And I was like, well, we've talked about this a bunch, you know, like now as a like. So Vincent was working himself through John Dee's spirit diaries. Now, remember what I said before, that historians basically assume that Kelley was a fraud. Hold that thought. And those of you interested in Enochian, add this one. Well, if you use that as some kind of emerging technology or whatever you consider it, you have to make peace with the fact, I would think, that John Dee writes this down, but this is all what Kelley saw. So if Kelley is just kind of a liar and a con, what's the point of doing this? Added to that, if you work through the Enochian very closely, as Alan and I have spent the last, 10 years of our lives doing, you find things really amazing in ways that neither Dee nor Kelley could have known about. So what does a traditional historian do with this? Well, they can't, because now I'm going to go back here where Vincent says, well, Madimi is unique. Madimi bugged the heck out of him. Kelley didn't respond well to Madimi. Basically, Madimi would show up as this little girl, and it looks pretty like you'd get locked up today if this spirit shows up and is naked every now and then, and she And we see Kelley complaining, oh, this is so awful. You get the feeling Kelley is protesting too much, to cop a line from Shakespeare. It's like, oh my God, she's exposing herself. It's yes, Kelley, continue on. But so here, there's a particular place in John Dee's Spirit Diaries where this Lord Albert Lasky has arrived from Poland. Another thing historians didn't really do was to look at the history of Lasky much. Lasky is a true con artist. He's on wife number 3. Wife number 2 is the illegitimate daughter of the former king of Poland, and he and the current wife have walled this woman up in a castle, taken all of her money, and now he is arriving in England, and the whole thing is very weird. The third wife, Sabine Deceive, is accompanied by her brother, Vincent Deceive, who later publishes a bunch of quatrains of Nostradamus. Sabine Deceive is connected to the Medici family, and if you remember, it's the Queen Mother of France, who is from that family, that brings Nostradamus to court. So it gets to be rather labyrinthine. But this is right here what Vincent was focused on. Like, why is she showing up with this Lasky and Lacey weirdness? What that is that Kelley is scrying into the stone, and according to Dee, according to Kelley, Madimi is saying, well, you may be related to the family of the Queen of England. That's what the Lacey weirdness is. And if you were smart, and you would never say or write down such a thing. That's heresy, because it's getting into the whole secession problem. So if any of you want to know Vincent's take on when Dee and Kelley are telling the truth or not, well, this is Kelley that he's focused in on. And so you can see here, I was saying, well, what do you mean? Why? What's the matter with that? And so Vincent here says, well, he wants to know about Madimi as a general plot device of the angels. Okay. So I said, I don't think the angels need plot devices. And he's like, no, he wants to explain Kelley's behavior. Things that Kelley does that need plot devices, that something has to happen to make Kelley do something. And then I put these things in italics. What is real and what is performance? Because Vincent, thinking that he has gotten into the head of Edward Kelley, has basically by this point, 2013, said, we know starting out that this is performance. Kelley's very clairvoyant. He can look into someone's eyes, presumably, and sense what they want, which makes it very easy to manipulate someone. But that's different. Being clairvoyant is different from his actually communicating with whomever he was talking to. So Vincent's belief towards the end of his field work in Prague, we like to call it, is that Madimi came in and just changed the whole show. That now Kelley is saying things and then shocked at what he is saying. And after that, by the way, you start to have the whole Enochian adventure. So anyway, let me go back to the other slides here.
Can you hear me too?
Sure.
Yes. Well, I think, we all agree that there was extreme controversy both to Kelley and to Vincent. And yet, at the same time, if we see past that, we're seeing an incredible insight, not just into science and physics, but into the real emotional meaning of history and karma and even alchemy. So we're trying to focus here, obviously, on the beautiful lessons to be learned. Mm-hmm. And
well, and I'm setting, just bringing that up to illustrate a kind of problem that is, if you're going to go about history in a kind of conventional way, well, first of all, you assume that alchemy is bunk. Talking to angels is bunk. And you're just going to look at these empirical things. Now, I'm an English professor. I like stories. So, I'm not a professional historian. I'm sure they wouldn't have me. But if you were, then you want something empirical, right? So one of the things you have, one of the few things you have, is Dee's diary. Problem. Dee's diary are spirit diaries. So what do you do with, well, these are, hundreds of pages of what the angels told Kelley. All right. So then you have both of them are spies. So you know that it's likely, for example, if John Dee is writing down something like Albert Lasky may be related to the Lacy family, and implicit in that is he's a distant relative of Queen Elizabeth. Well, if Dee is writing that down and not getting arrested because we can figure he lives, one of his close neighbors is Sir Francis Walsingham, who's the British spy master. So if he's writing this down, it has to be a ploy, right? A kind of counterintelligence thing, because you wouldn't just write it down. It's heresy. So this is the empirical evidence you're going to use. And that's why I think that Vincent, and probably not only Vincent, decided, well, you're not going to come up with this the way that using traditional history. So there's one thing. Another thing is that if you are, and I know some of you in this audience are, if you're part of any initiatory system, sort of a Kabbalistically based initiatory system, one of the things you study is scrying the spirit vision, exactly what Kelley was doing for John Dee. Well, then you maybe don't care so much about empiricism, or do you? You've got to kind of find a way to make these two work together. By the way, I wanted to say what this picture is here. I don't know if anyone recognizes this a lot at all. Alishka Bridges took this picture. Actually, we went to Most in 2015. The only place there's an Edward Kelley statue and so on. This is if you go to the castle in Niven, which it's a replica of the one that was from Kelley's time. And you go to the top of the tower and you take pictures of the landscape. This is what you see. So that's what we used on the book cover.
We should give a little background that Most is the place where Kelley apparently died at the hands of King Rudolph for not revealing the secret of alchemy and also for dueling. And supposedly Kelley actually cursed the town of Most, and it was completely destroyed shortly after his death. We should also give the background for people that don't know the story, Terry, obviously, that Lasky was the Polish count who kind of sponsored Dee throughout. And actually, the things that we learned about alchemy from Vincent and therefore through Kelley, a lot of it had to do with Lasky's sponsorship. So there's many threads to that beautiful story.
Right. And now with Lasky's sponsorship, to make that even more complicated, we have lots of other English intelligence that says, how could Lasky sponsor anyone? He was broke.
Yeah, that's right. He pretended to be.
There's a problem. So these are just some pictures of Vincent. I think this is when he and Alishka were at, well, I don't know. Well, this one is in Prague. So, and I'm going to just go past. Oh, here's this is Alishka, who's also editing this with me. This is the only statue of Sir Edward Kelley, by the way. It's in Most. One of the things that Alishka wrote for this book that I think if you're just interested in Sir Edward Kelley that you'd find very interesting is, since she's able to read the Czech archives that I have great difficulty with, she wrote an appendix about the legacy of Kelley and the different places he wound up in Bohemia. So in Most, which is where I'm standing, and this is that backdrop that is on the cover there, you would think, since that's where he died, and died kind of horribly, that he wouldn't have the best reputation. It seems that's where he has the best reputation. They have a Sir Edward Kelley Day. They bring the local kids up to this castle. It's totally weird. And they have this really strange little Edward Kelley museum. So anyway, she wrote an interesting appendix on that, and also the history of the donkey and the cradle, which is the place that legendarily Kelley lived in Prague.
I should mention that Alishka was Vincent's partner at the time of his death.
Right. So, um, what I'm going to do at this point is put all of that kind of on a back burner and shift to alchemy and hope that these are three ideas that you keep in mind. This is to sort of deepen the mystery, not answer these questions. But so I mentioned these before, but what was alchemy before the First Crusade? Now, rather than give a kind of lecture on that, what I've done is in this thing to the side, do you see that scrolling up, I hope? No? The place where it says chat, well, you can scroll up to the top of it anyway. And if you do, the first thing I see is Chaim saying hi, and I said hello.
So just scroll to the top of the chat window. Yes, okay.
Yeah. So I want to just say what some of these links are, if this is something that you all want to explore later on, because it's a lot of fun. Okay, so this first link is a place where Alishka has put a lot of Vincent's articles on, and this is the Seeking the Stone article. Now, I'm going to talk about that real quickly, because this is a history of alchemy that Vincent was writing in the late 90s, I think, before I knew him. Not long after that, he and Jay Weidner, who I think some of you know, became interested in the story of the alchemist Fulcanelli, the 20th century alchemist, never identified. Some have identified him as Schwaller de Lubitz, some has other people, some say he's just alive. If you want to know more about that, you can read this book. So Jay and Vincent were working on this book when I met Vincent under unusual circumstances in 2000. And this is a book all about alchemy. So what, in the process of writing this book, which is a revision of this book over here, A Monument to the End of Time, one of the things Vincent noticed was that the way alchemy is talked about changes at the time of the First Crusade. Early on, and by the way, those of you that are in our discussion group on Facebook, I can stick up a couple articles about this later. But in
Can I just make a quick suggestion here, Terry? You know, Vincent met the co-author there, Jay Weidner, through me, actually, yeah. And just to get a bit of a vision here, that short thumbnail, that book was more than just, you know, the emergence from South America of the Great Cross of Hendaye, which was a monument to the end of time in the sense that the cross point on a cross of the right geometrical symbols created the kind of charge implosion fusion which is alchemic, which is more than just the end of time. It is where all time rotations converge and fuse and become one. It is a great cross.
Well, that's a brilliant way of putting it, Dan. Thanks. I mean, that's far better than what I could do. I think what happened, honestly, to most people who were reading about the cross was, oh, this means the world's going to end. 2012 has passed. It hasn't ended. Yeah. Which is not what it was about at all.
Yes, and Terry, I just wanted to finish that thought. Just to say that, you know, your next two questions, in your questions there, the first question, Vincent always said, after the First Crusade was when they had access to the ground-up cobblestone. So it's the first time in history you find historically documented successful productions of gold in alchemy. And Vincent always said that because after the First Crusade, that's when they got access to the cobblestone and therefore the true Philosopher's Stone projected powder. And that's the turning point in the history of alchemy.
Right. Now, Dan, can I throw something back at you with that one? Because you're absolutely right. And he didn't waver on that point, whereas other things he'd fudge a little bit. But that one he held to. Now, it's kind of dangerous to imagine getting inside of Vincent's head maybe, but clearly that's what he thought. Now, once I asked him, Vincent, how do you know that is true? Or is it just that that's what you have believed is true for 1,000 years? And he actually backed off, which he wouldn't always do, and said, well, that's the problem. I don't know. So I just offer that, and I think I interrupted you again, Dan. I'm sorry.
Well, no, I was just going to, a footnote there in terms of the connection between that concept and your next two questions, which were what is the relationship to ancient sacred alphabet and even, or Hebrew, and the connection to Ophanim Enochian, and all of those things, the connection to alchemy. Well, obviously, if we're right that the plasma domain symmetries, whose shadows are indexed to make not just the tetracube in Hebrew and Sanskrit, which we've animated, but also the superset of that, which is the hypercube symmetry of those same spirals on the torus called Ophanim Enochian, the real angel script. And in fact, all of those things are only a way to get plasma to implode, conjugate, fuse, and get centripetal, which is the very essence of alchemy, isotope transition, non-destructive charge collapse, whatever you want to call it. So the relationship to alchemy comes clear. It is a pure symmetry physics of fusion itself, both in terms of the physics of alchemy and the physics of human fusion. So it all fits together beautifully in the metaphor.
Well, and if you were going to express that in ancient Greece, you would express it in terms of geometry, right? That's what you would do, and you would assume that that answer already existed as a perfect form. I mean, pull out your, Plato 101. There's an ideal form. So now you're studying Euclid, and John Dee wrote the introduction to Billingsley's Euclid, which was the first one in English. So you have, as I've told some of you here before, you have this really strange grammatical structure in ancient Greek that is used to create this sort of helping hand. So if you were reading the ancient Greek literally, you would have something like, let there be drawn a blah, 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 perpendicular to the blah, blah, blah. So it's already been done in the ideal world, and you're trying to replicate it. So the way that connects to alchemy isn't terribly clear if you just think of alchemy as, I don't know, a medieval thing with people with puffers and stuff like that. So there's a sacred geometry, and then, as Dan said, with the sacred alphabets, or I'm to phrase it another way, you're going to look at the sacred geometry of those alphabets, which will take you to Hebrew. Now, just to show that I'm not rambling, because it probably sounds like it, I'm going to continue with those links I put up at the beginning, because I have learned I can't talk and type at the same time. So I put a link up there of that Seeking the Stone. Finish that thought real quickly. In this book, while it is focusing on the Great Cross of Hendaye, what Vincent expanded from the first version to this one, and I would like face-to-face to talk to Jay Weidner about this, because I was editing this and doing a lot of the, hauling books out from all over. I don't know that he asked Jay about this. I think it was more like, I'm just going to add all this and see if Jay notices. But that is my impression, and I would love to talk to Jay about it. Anyway, Vincent started in this book adding things in about the history of alchemy, which was the same thing that you would read in this Seeking the Stone article. So to me, today, the fascinating part about this isn't the wonderful detective work that Jay and Vincent did about the Cross of Hendaye. It's the history of alchemy that's in there. Okay, so that's the first link I had there. All right, and then the next one is just a Facebook event page for the release of an Alchemical Enigma, followed by our Facebook group. I'm at the stage of my life where I know exactly what I mean, but I'm shocked by what comes out of my mouth. So if I say something really bizarre, please ask a question. It might not have.
Don't be too humble, Terry. You're doing great. And that Facebook group is the Alchemy Ophanim Enochian, which Terry has been so instrumental in leading. And remember that, Monument to the End of Time originally started out as meeting the wife of Atahualpa, who had just been murdered, and they're revealing the family jewels, the family wisdom, which was basically the wisdom of not just alchemy, but reading the plasma of stars and how they converge. And this eventually got carved into a cross in South France at Hendaye, and the metaphors started imploding. And speaking of metaphors imploding, the question that Billy Weisberg just asked was so perfect. He said, is that point of converging timelines Planck, and is that the end of time? It's such a beautiful question because now we know exactly what time is. Unlike Einstein, I think, we know precisely time is simply charge rotating. And where charge rotations converge, fuse, implode, or conjugate, there all rotations converge into one. So it isn't the end of time, it's actually the climax of time. It's the conjugation, the fractal implosion, where stillness is available, where all timelines converge, as they say in the song, where all paths and errands meet.
Well, an apocalypse comes from ancient Greek, right? So that's the unveiling is that point of silence. I mean, it's very simple and profound and so the end of time, I think people tend to get a little too carried away with what they mean by that. That center point can be a monad. That's John Dee's most famous work, and that word means a unit in ancient Greek. So from that, you can expand it to the tetractys. You can do all kinds of geometric tricks with it, and if you're really doing them the right way, you're seeing the divine. I mean, it makes hair stand up on your arms or wherever, top of your head. Okay, so I'm going to keep going down here, and I've told you, yeah?
What Dee called the monad, we today call implosion. Exactly.
There, yeah. So I've gone past the Facebook group. Okay, the next is a link to the first in a series of articles that that's J. Allen Moore, my husband, he and I wrote for the Journal of the Western Mystery Tradition on Enochian. So I'm going to go off on one of these little digressions that I said was okay. Really, that was so that I could digress. I've got to see if I can, outdo Dan at that. And he's a pro, and I don't think I'm going to win. So there, I'm jumping to the end of this. When the angels, because that's from within their cultural point of view, what John Dee and Edward Kelley called them, when they started coming through Kelley, and Dee was writing it down, different things happened. Right? There was an alphabet. There were instructions on how to make a laman. Well, first a holy table. All these different things that some of you have heard Alan or myself talk about. And then you get to the grand finale in ways, the Great Table of Earth. And Ave says, here is the purpose of this Great Table of Earth. These are the 4 watchtowers of the Enochian system. Now, I know there are very wonderful people who have written about this and say, we don't know what it's for, just use them. I don't know if that makes someone happy, great, but like, why? It sort of seems like, I've got a fire thrower. I'll just use it. Oops, it set that on fire. That was a bad idea. Well, I'll use it this way. But then if you look right here at what Ave says the tablet contains, boy.
Maybe would you zoom in a little bit? Yeah, that's good. Good. Yeah.
Okay. I mean, you got a delightful problem here, don't you? It just, there's these grids, right, of all these kind of wild-looking letters, and what do they contain? Well, all human knowledge. Now, I know some of you, because this is a great group, can jump right ahead now in ways that Dee and Kelley couldn't, and you could say, well, in that still silent point, or as above, so below, within, so without. That's just the transfer of knowledge by Bell's theorem or something like that. Like, good, you can do that. What were Dee and Kelley supposed to do? These have all human knowledge, all physics, all the knowledge of all the elemental creatures, what they were created for, blah, 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 blah. How you find metals, what they do, the congelation and virtues of stones, including the philosopher's stone, the conjoining and knitting together of natures. Number 6, by the way, moving from place to place is often considered telepathy, astral travel, remote viewing, but still, just this table? It's like, come on.
But
so we could
remember,
go. Yeah.
When when Dee said to conjure, there's hundreds of books about the life of John Dee, and most of them have the word conjure in the title. And now we know the word conjugate has a very particular meaning.
That's great.
And when you conjugate, you literally create what's called longitudinal electromagnetics, which we now know is the physics of action at a distance to transport, you know?
Mm-hmm. That's great. So now it's easy with what you have here to also go to the other way and just say, well, these guys are crazy. Well, they've been sent by as spies by Queen Elizabeth. So maybe this is just, they can't be too crazy, or else, England's really screwed up in their choice of people to send into the Holy Roman Empire. So maybe this is some kind of weird ploy, because cryptographers will look at the Great Table of Earth and say it looks like nothing so much as what's called a Cardan grill, or if you think of a chessboard, 64 squares, and they have all kinds of interesting properties. The trouble is, as people study them, well, one person, Fendon, I believe his name, said, if Kelley's making this up, he's got to be a literary genius. At the same time, he is making some of it up. Now, maybe he was a literary genius. Maybe that's why he influenced Shakespeare. I don't know if we'll get that far. But he can't have done all of it. I'll give you a quick example. Along with the great table containing this, you know what else it contains? The crappiest cipher in illiterate, semi-literate Latin I have ever seen, that basically says, hey, you need to swap spouses. Now, I look at that and I think, well, these guys are pretty good with Latin. Probably they just saw it there. Who knows? But you always have this going on, as Vincent would say, on many levels. Okay, so I was talking about those links. So Alan and I wrote 3 articles about this, probably spent way too much of our lives, or, well, actually not enough of them, going through and trying to find out, what is this table for? Also, we were looking at particular blinds because it seemed that the angels, or whoever they were teaching Dee and Kelley. So there are things that they didn't understand at first. And then the answer to that, you have to get to a certain level of understanding to understand the next. And if you want an example, I go to that website from the Journal of Western Mystery Tradition. And the example there is from the Seal of Amet. And in another article, we do one with the Enochian governors. Okay, then the link after that is just a fun link. That's from my friend. Her artist name is Amy Lionheart. But it's an animated video they did when she was drawing a reproduction of the one known picture of Sir Edward Kelley, which I should have put in this slide presentation, and I didn't. I apologize for that. But let me back out here. Okay, so in this one drawing, and it's by Francis Klein, it shows up, Francis Klein, by the way, was brought to England in the early 1600s after John Dee had died in England at Mortlake, and Kelley had died where you saw there in Most in 1598. So John Dee dies at Mortlake. After John Dee dies, that area becomes the Mortlake Tapestry Works, very famous tapestry works, and Francis Klein was brought in as an artist. There were apparently buildings on Dee's property other than the house. The house was still there for another about 150 years, but they tore down the outer buildings and built this tapestry work. So Klein was involved with that and also made this painting of Kelley's. If you have looked at very much stuff about Dee and Kelley, you've probably seen that picture that is in Merritt Casaubon's A True and Faithful Relation. It looks like that engraving that Casaubon made was actually from this painting of Klein's. So anyway, that's what, and April was so nice to reproduce it. Okay, now after that, you have a link to Mysteries of the Great Cross at Hendaye. It's not all online, but it's now you can get a fair amount of it in Google Books. And if you go there and you search for this word, Amniel, you will get a very interesting history that I've only heard from Vincent and also from one other person who claimed they heard it from Crowley. But that's another story and we won't go there now. So this is to illustrate in the West alchemy before the Crusades. So supposedly, now this is the mystery of Isis the prophetess. Now, remember, Greek goddess stories get conflated. So Isis, is Isis the same as the Roman Magna Mater or Kybella or, huh? In some ways, yes, and in some ways, no. And Tufan, this is part of the reason of why I was so excited that we're going to be doing an Enochian working at the Temple of Artemis, which is on one of the ancient Kybella shrines. And just to throw something else on there, Madimi, you can take Madimi as a spirit of Mars in traditional magic, or a messenger of Mercury, which is how that is in Dee and Kelley. But you can also take it as an acronym for the Magna Mater. And that's actually how Alan and I take it, just to give a little teaser to what we may be doing at the Temple of Artemis. Okay, back to Amniel. So Amniel appears as Isis the prophetess is telling her son Horus the secret of alchemy. And it's, he wants to know it. So she teaches it to him. But when she says what it is, as Vincent describes it, it's flat. It's like it has to be more than that. So you can read the story of this by, again, going to that link, typing in Amniel, and you can at least pull out enough to find this story of Isis, the prophetess, to her son Horus, who is the only person that she reveals the secret of alchemy to. Now, how does that link to sacred languages in a more prosaic way? Because Amniel is not an ancient Egyptian word or an ancient Greek word, right? You see the suffix on it, it's Hebrew. So Amniel is the higher angel and has shown up. And this mystery also seems, by the way, kind of, let's say, Kundalini charged. Others might say, frankly, incestuous, but however you want to look at that. So they do this, I conjure you in the name of fire, I conjure you in the name of da-da-da-da-da. We get the guardian of the underworld, all these things. And then you get the secret, and the secret's like, huh? That's the secret? Did I miss something? Horus says that the secret of all of creation is to know that a man can only produce a man, a lion, a dog. And if things happen contrary to nature, that's a miracle and they can't exist because only nature can overcome nature, blah, 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 blah. And maybe if you're a genius, that means something to you, okay? But most people get to that and it's like, well, this is why alchemy is bunk. That was a lot of buildup for nothing. That is a transition, I would say, into Hebraic alchemy. So up to the point of the First Crusade, usually, the records we have tend to connect alchemy in the West with Hebraic alchemy. Now in China, they do something really fascinating and different, but it is still connected to a divine language. In this case, they have the whole story of Fuji, and some of you know that. And then there's Fuji and his sister. But there's the hexagrams of the I Ching. Now, Vincent will go on to explain how you can divide those up into an 8x8, that is 64 magic square, and do the same thing with Enochian. And by that time, usually you've got a crowd kind of either glazed over or like, huh? Or, okay. What this says to me is that up to the First Crusade, what you're looking at is a kind of spiritual process of initiation. You're not exactly looking at recipes like I've got powder and it's going to make gold. Could be wrong. But at the time of the First Crusade, as Vincent and Jay write about, you start to get, well, first of all, you get recipes. And you also get the idea that let's see. That the
just
secret, yeah.
While you're looking there, just you know, in defense of the original forms of alchemy based on sacred alphabets, that although at that time we weren't consciously aware that those alphabets were simply symmetry operations, now that we know they are, we can see that the hexagrams of the I Ching were a simple but precise metaphor for DNA codons, and more than that, hex tetracubic symmetry, which we now know is the symmetry root of the origin of Hebrew as well. So all ancient alphabets ultimately were teaching you how to throw magnetic domains in the right symmetry to cause them to implode, to cast a spell, which is the alchemy of fusion. So really, as far as they could do physics in their day, those sacred alphabets were about alchemy, but they weren't interpreted as physics till much later. But now, when we put that together with the recipes, the actual transmutations that occurred later, now we can connect the physics with the metaphysics, perhaps.
Well, and yeah, and let me, Lisa, that's a great question. She's asking what would be the sort of starting place for Alchemy 101. Well, that and Enochian 101, honestly, first you want to see, well, who's Alchemy 101, right? If the way that we're talking about it here, I would say Jay and Vincent's book, or just that Seeking the Stone article is the best introduction. That's not the story most people tell, though it's similar to a few folks. Also, well, I'll just leave it at that. If those of you who are going to be in Prague or have heard Paul Harris speak here about alchemy, when he's talking about how to make the plant stone, okay, the way Paul is presenting that is if you join the Alchemy Guild, that's how they would teach it to you. And there are 3 kingdoms, and you're told now I'm cribbing this from Paul's presentation, okay? But you're supposed to start first with the plant stone. It's not going to mess you up. You're not going to inhale metal vapor and die or something like that. But this gap between physical instruction in the plant stone and everything else, like you get to the animal stone, are you making life? And what I would argue with Enochian is, if we're talking about the galactic kingdom, you know, how you get from this to that is pretty big. So what I would do is read the Seeking the Stone, listen to some presentations about plant alchemy that include the physical process of distilling. And after that, either you're hooked and you'll follow your own path or not. But that's a great question. Yeah?
Terry, would you zoom in on that text just a little bit? Sorry.
Oh, no problem. Can you see that? That makes it go off my screen, but
it's better. Thank you.
Okay, sure. So this is the question that Vincent is asking in that article, and of course, it's fairly transparent. He thinks the answer is yes. Now, Dan earlier referenced that Kelley, we think, had the powder but didn't know how to make it. That becomes, I think, what the shift is. That at first there's an initiatory group. They know how to do something. They've kept their mouth shut. Then sort of the secret of the powder has leaked, but then everything else is forgotten. Or at least that's one interpretation of this great novel that we're writing here, right? Okay, so this next story is, yeah?
Maybe just to say that, and again, on some of this I learned from Vincent, but to connect the physics again with the metaphysics, that powder, if we're right, whether that was the black goo, as you say, or whether it was the black cobblestone, either way, we believe it had a super high dielectric constant. So Vincent said that as Kelley would mix a small amount of that powder in a size of about the grain of rice wrapped in a certain kind of wax, that when you dropped it in the red hot mercury and the phonon, which is a sonic geometry, was correct, that's how you achieve the transmutation. The mercury would become gold. And at first it sounds like a mystery, but actually we now understand if you use a phonon wave and a capacitive trigger, you can actually predict the frequencies of isotope transition. So the key was that the stone itself was an implosive capacitance super high dielectric constant, which is what happens if you mix vaporized gold with the meteoritic glass with the right foam geometry. So once you understand implosive capacitance, as for example why the Ark of the Covenant reduced radioactivity, you can understand the mystery of the Philosopher's Stone making fusion. And it was the same sequence of symmetry operations that allowed ancient letters to teach alchemy as alphabet.
Well, and you know, I know I've said this before, but if I have a life work, it is going to be to write about these letters and so on, because we tend to look at language as something that kind of organically we evolve and we can speak, and then we can speak better, or rather than, you know, and the other part of that would be, no, it's creation and we're only however many thousand years old. But if you think that there were great civilizations that totally collapsed, one of the most persistent stories is that of Atlantis and the use and abuse of Atlantean crystals, but also of those crystals being able to focus energy to do transmutation. Because something that I often ask myself about is, why would so many people believe this? And my answer to that became, well, past life memories. Somewhere back there, you know it was done. Why can't it be done anymore? Anyway, I'm going to go back here, and if you read that article, Seeking the Stone, you'll also find it opens with, after Vincent and Jay had finished these books, Vincent was sitting around Notre Dame Cathedral, and someone came up who had the, you know, lovely name of, I believe, Christian Frere, which means Christian brother, so this isn't this guy's name, who said some things to him, and then he had never saw the guy again. And that's the guy that he's talking. Well, actually, it's not. That's a different guy. Never mind. I'm going to go to the next slide anyway. Okay, let me make this a little.
Terry?
Yeah?
I think the point you brought out there was so beautiful about there's a long history of the sacred stones. You know, they've been called the Tuoi stone, the fire crystal of Atlantis, the Girku, the Silmarion. All of these histories of seeking the stone, we think actually resolved at the same physics. And you know, I knew the physicists who did the experiments after Casey described in such detail the Tuoi stone fire crystal of Atlantis. It was a physicist named Sutton from Maryland. And then when my partner Louis Acker there, we wrote actually a book about it and met with the crystallographers. And so we actually studied the 6- and 8-sided phonon geometry of these implosive crystals, which were said to make gravity waves and why Atlantis sank and all that stuff. So whether you're talking about Girku or Silmarion or Tuoi stone or fire crystal, the history of seeking the stone is very global. And again, the issue is how you make a conjugate or implosion in that stone, and we now know the secret. The phonon geometry have to be self-similar to the electrical. And you know, once you study the physics principle, suddenly all the concept of all these stones fits in one picture.
Well, and let's go to something you talked about. In fact, you were just talking about it last week, Dan, of how do you use these principles to make the world more peaceful, particularly, say, the Holy Land more peaceful. Now, so you have another excerpt from Seeking the Stone, but let me give you some backstory. And those of you who are on the Facebook group, I mentioned that we could bring in some other alchemists. Well, one of them that I want to talk about is Pope Sylvester, or Gerbert de Aurillac. If you like good novels, Deborah Harkness, who is a John Dee scholar, but some of you may know the All Souls trilogy, she has Gerbert de Aurillac as like this horrible villain. I mean, it's a wonderful portrayal. I noticed it in particular because, well, it's a good, just very well written, but also he's not a villain in Vincent and Jay's book. He's one of the people keeping the secret alive. Now, let me set up a little context for you here. So in the Mysteries book, Vincent and Jay argue, and I remember Vincent writing this. I hope he sent it to Jay at some point, but this was all stuff that he was putting in there in like 2002, early 2002. So the idea was there were people keeping this idea alive, and then there is this order of Zion, and they're kind of like a research group in the Holy Land. So somehow, well, first of all, the Muslims and the Jews and the Christians in the Holy Land are all getting along, which doesn't always happen. And there is this group that they're researching something down there. Now, no one else explains it this way, all right? I think this is another one of these reverse engineering things of Vincent's that leads to the story of the rabbi and the curse, etc. So anyway, Pope Sylvester has them down and they find something. So they come back to somewhere in France and say, hey, we found it. We have to go down there. And now, then what happens is shady. And I'm going to tell a story on Vincent now, because he had me go check all of his references for this. But he held a few of them out. And since he's died, I don't know, I was bored. When I check the references, they don't check out. I don't think he intentionally made them up, but they don't check out. And they're the ones that have to do with the central point of the First Crusade, this rabbi that he's talked about. So to tell you that story in very much in brief, if you haven't heard it, Vincent's story or his joke about this was that he was this red-haired Irish guy crusading down, and after going over Herod's wall, that this rabbi came out and maybe right before he died, cursed this person and said that you are never going to forget until you understand what you've done, which somehow equaled 1,000 years, right? That's the story. It's a great story. So what never made sense to Al and I about that is that if the people that were in the Holy Land who sent for help, which is what Vincent describes there, said, hey, we need help, why did the Crusaders come down and kill all of them? And so, in fact, that's why I was looking at some of Vincent's references, and I found that he can't find the answer either. And he said, well, this is as close as we're going to get, that there are these Jewish alchemists doing some kind of alchemy connected to the Bahir, which isn't a place normal alchemical historians go. And what I would deduce for that is simply someone got greedy and said, oh, that's how you do it. We just need that stuff. We'll steal it. And the secret was lost. But, you know, that's my reading. But if you
and
don't...
Just, Terry, is it okay?
Please.
If I may just oversimplify the piece of that story that most excited me, it was a kind of a criticism of Peter the Hermit, that, remember, Peter the Hermit is basically the best advertising agency to make the First Crusade happen. And he came back from the Holy Land, supposedly, according to Vincent, having discovered that the Jews and Muslims in Jerusalem had discovered how to grind up the Kaaba stone to use that powder, and supposedly one of the, which became the Philosopher's Stone projected powder that then Dee and Kelley and Flamel used, and that, in fact, the famous story of the mad caliph who allowed that Kaaba stone, as documented historically, to be ground up and the volume disappeared, was in fact that he went mad because he was eating that powder.
Yeah.
And it's very much like the people today eating the monoatomic gold powder without the right hygiene instructions, and that's a whole other story. So basically, Peter the Hermit comes back and says to the Christians, the Christianity is going to lose unless we get to the physics of alchemy first, and therefore we must fund the First Crusade, and that's how he sold it to the bankers. I mean, that's maybe an oversimplification, but that's the
Well, no, and
story
then
as I
that makes
understand.
it all about money, because then what do the Crusaders do? Well, they come through Europe, they kill all of the Jews. Peter the Hermit gets this group of peasants for the Peasants' Crusade and marches them to Constantinople, where they're all slaughtered. They're supposed to be going to the aid of the Eastern Orthodox Church, and instead, like they sack. Well, it's a bit later, but they sack Constantinople. I mean, it's pure greed, and I don't think any traditional scholar who looks at the history of the Crusades would argue that it's anything but greed combined with religious fervor stirred up, yeah, by Peter the Hermit is certainly one of them. There were all of these miracles that supposedly happened that are reported different ways by different people, but those miracles also have the effect of keeping all the soldiers in line, so they don't, they're hungry and they don't just go home. Another thing is that one might say, what else? Well, there's one other thing that makes it urgent to, if you're a greedy, nasty person, to go with all this slaughter, and that's the Muslim control of the Holy Land has changed. Under the Mad Caliph, it's been one group of Muslims, and now it's another group, and this other group is not as tolerant of the Christians and Jews. So it's like, well, we better go take over. There's even a point where the Egyptians are going to come help the Christian army, but of course, after they've slaughtered so many people, like, who wants to help these folks, right? Now, add to that, there's this period of about 4 or 5 years after the first big slaughter that something is going on and no one knows what. And I think that's the point where Vincent believed somebody figured out the secret, took it back to Europe. Okay, I'm going to skip to number 3 here because we're going to run out of time. And that's why did he consider Enochian related to alchemy? Well, because he liked Enochian. That's not a very good reason, is it? How about the angel Ave says it is? Well, okay, he's got a multi-lifetime investment in this stuff, but what if it's true? Well, then you're looking at a situation where humanity has so messed things up, become so violent, so homicidal, genocidal, that humans aren't going to survive. They're going to wipe each other out, or the civilizations will collapse. And if you believe that happened once or twice before, you don't want it to happen again. So Vincent looked at Enochian as a literal intervention. That is, that there's this intervention that is going to prevent humans from wiping themselves out. So if that also led to one of the stories we love to tell here is D. Kelley being able to whip up a wind that turned back the Spanish Armada. Is that because, the angels were on the side of England and not Spain? No. It's that given all of the killer monkeys running around Europe trying to wipe each other out, things would balance out a little more this way and a little more if this happened. Or at least that was his argument then. And if you study Enochian in enough detail that you start to see how different parts of it fit together, you learn about alignments to the night sky. The night sky that it lines up to would have been the night sky about 10 years ago, not the one in D. Kelley's time. But that's a whole another topic.
And Terry, if I could just comment that I personally was with Vincent more than one occasion when we did these rituals, which called storms the size of continents. I mean, I personally have that experience. And I think one of the things that we learn is that the large elementals want the humans embedded in them as plasma to communicate, because once we, in our storms are supposed to go into chaos until we learn our relationship to them, because that's how we ride the long wave. So in that sense, even though, as we were joking, that some say that Dee and Kelley's angel calls were the fall of Western civilization, as Michael Sarian said, because we called in intent that was bigger than us. But on the other hand, if we don't even become aware of the intelligence that's bigger than us, and realize our relationship to it is plasma symmetry, their alphabet. And the other thing I think just wanted to say is Tamara's comment here is very beautiful. In the bottom, she's saying the Kaaba stone in Mecca is called the Chintamani stone, the Chintamani stone, and it previously in Templar possession, and that's the issue here, is the Templar possession. And Edward Buehler-Lytton says this was the existence of Agartha, which is probably the Abzu, the existence, and so all these stories, and Vril and the Grails, all these stories of seeking the stone were actually seeking the symmetry to achieve not just plasma fusion or charge implosion or isotope transition or alchemy, but actually the only way a group of humans can achieve fusion in such a way as to fuse their plasma body and accelerate it starward or sunward or literally the Holy Grail. So in a sense, yes, the First Crusade, by seeking alchemy, devolved into pure greed, but the symbolism underneath it, the real physics of alchemy and the spiritual physics of alchemy, is actually still transformatory.
Oh yeah, and so Dan, keep in mind, like I tend to be less straightforward in what I say than you. Yeah, absolutely, you can make storms, you can do all, or that's just a story I'm telling you, and I think I'll leave it to you to figure that out. Mainly because it could cause me trouble in my day job. This is going out on YouTube, and so I'm quite content to talk about things as a novel. By the way, I'm not answering questions yet, and it's because maybe one of you can help me here. My window has gone away with the whole chat conversation, so I'm not seeing the questions. Once I made it bigger here, it got rid of that whole window somehow. So, or Dan, would you mind relaying if there are any questions? Because I'd love to answer them. Otherwise, I'm not trying to ignore anyone here.
But go ahead, Terry, please. So that was a lovely comment from Tamara, but that's at the bottom. But you have your outline. You just go ahead, Terry, please.
Okay. Well, if there is a question, maybe Dan, you could relay it to me.
Sure.
So that, in fact, is the fast version through my presentation. What I wanted to do now was to see what questions you had, and otherwise I would just kind of continue through from the First Crusade forward, but it slows down a bit there, right? Because now what you have is a lot of a history of recipes, and you don't have anyone actually able to produce the stone until supposedly a couple hundred years. Now, one of those people is Nicholas Flamel, who Flamel. I'm sorry. Which flame of L? I mean, these are linguistic puns.
Yes,
now you can.
Even Emma Watson and Harry Potter dedicated their whole first episode to Flamel, so yes. That's of interest to all.
And Flamel is, of course, associated with Notre Dame Cathedral. Now, if you want to be a cynic about Flamel, and this is coming from Vincent, who claimed to have the memories of Flamel. Okay, so, and no one can really figure out the Flamel story any more than the Kelley story. In fact, it's even worse because you start to get evidence of the story like 100 years or so later, and it's looking backwards. And you also can look at things and say, well, gee, I think this Flamel guy just married well. But he says he found this Book of Solomon, and so you have the connection again to sacred alphabets, a secret that was passed on from a Book of Abraham, and then eventually you get to Fulcanelli. I'm not going to try to fill in all of those blanks, but with Fulcanelli, you are also looking at a real split in the Western esoteric tradition. Now, Vincent's guess was that this split went back to the time of Dee and Kelley. That is, you see a different kind of tradition resurfacing with Fulcanelli. And that also involves people like the Comte Chazal. It gets to Saint Germain. it gets back to England via a person called Backstrom. If if this were a class here and I could hear you all, I'd say, anyone heard of that? Speak up. So the two traditions come back together, but in the English-speaking world, you get a lot more focus on ceremonial magic and then Enochian brought in, whereas in the more continental tradition, you have a lot more of a focus on alchemy. And if you look at the real adepti, there's always some kind of connection back to the Bahir. Yeah?
Well, you know that, as you say, to try to make that connection here, but when Flamel says he discovered the ancient Solomon text and suddenly he had the recipe, and by the way, it was well documented that during Flamel's lifetime, the amount of money he spent was astronomical, and he apparently had some source, and it makes sense. And then his story apparently is his limitation was the red powder. But Solomon's text and later Fulcanelli's recipes also turned out to be the symmetry of plasma domains called green language carved on the wall of Gothic cathedrals called Cyma erecta, Cyma reversa, was a sequence of plasma domain symmetries to achieve charge fusion, literally plasma fusion, in the waveguide that was the walls of the alchemic Gothic cathedral, meaning that in all cases the relationship was between the implosive, quote-unquote, sacred symmetry of ancient languages being at the same time a recipe for alchemy.
And so you look at the cathedrals as as an alchemical vessel, just like you'd look at Egyptian pyramids that way. And Schwaller in his The Temple in Man, which is this brilliant study. I know Schwaller has other problems, one being he's totally anti-Semitic, thinks women are stupid. I mean, I have problems considering Schwaller as Fulcanelli just because of various blindnesses he has. But Kelley had a few also. So Schwaller in the Temple in Man, which is translated into English, many of his works aren't, but that one is. It's a brilliant work if you have time to look at it. And if you're reading through it, he uses the term symbolique, and that's what he means by green language. A lot of people think it's, this magical argot, it's punning, it's this and that. Well, it's all of those things. But Schwaller tells one of his students that another person often identified as possibly Fulcanelli just has it wrong. It's not just this punning. Oh, what is it then? Well, it's the effect it has if you are in this powerful temple structure and you see things without the interference of having to encode it like we do with the phonetic language. That is, it works as a pure waveguide. It works as an alchemical vessel. And one of the things it does is to increase consciousness. So a shift in awareness changes you. When I'm teaching and I have students write about problems and they're like, well, I don't see a solution. It's like, well, just understanding something is doing something. And then you have a whole shift in awareness. It's Einstein's, how do you solve a problem at the level at which it was created? You don't. You don't. You shift to another level. So implicit also in this idea of green language that Fulcanelli has, and you all know the puns with that, right? Fulcan, like Vulcan, the forge maker. So implicit in that is that eventually you're going to find things that resonate. You want them to resonate at a level that is going to affect change and affect evolution. You can make them resonate. I tell you, you turn on a bass subwoofer really loud so that people around you can't think. Everything's going to resonate with that, but it's not going to help your evolution very much, in my humble opinion. So,
Terry?
Yeah.
I think some of the people don't know that by Schwaller, Terry means Schwaller de Lubitz.
I'm sorry.
And by the translator of temple in man was the most famous sacred geometer on the planet, perhaps Robert Lawler, who was also the hero of our work at Gaiam Transicon, and also the hero of the famous Ray Flowers Sangreal.com, was Schwaller de Lubitz and Robert Lawler. And what he meant by temple in man was literally the perfect implosive alchemic plasma body symmetrically, really. And so, and by the change in consciousness is, if somebody has an imploding awareness and just stands next to you, then suddenly your focus on the problem will be transformed because it's implosive and alchemic and conjugate and fractal.
And I'll just give you an example for that with my experience with Dan. You know, Dan, now when you're talking, I'm kind of pleased. I understand what you're saying. At first, when Alan and I met you, we'd listen and we'd think, God, he's brilliant. That's great. And then we'd go somewhere else and we'd be like, what did he say? What was that? So one of the things I've learned to test expanding awareness is, if you get an idea that you've never had that insight before, can you maintain that when you're out of the energy field of the person that taught that to you? That's also why both in ceremonial magic and in alchemy, you know, there's an idea of a transmission from master to student, because that person's energy really does affect someone in a profound way. Okay.
It's even related to the idea that bliss is itself contagious and has critical mass, and the same is true of awareness. That's why when people arrange themselves in symmetry, like in a temple, they create a plasma temple in and of themselves, and that is alchemic.
There's I did want to mention sometime during this presentation, there's an idea of a threefold transmutation in alchemy, of which, you know, people focus more on the lead into gold rather than perfecting one's spirituality. But there's also a third, well, and a fourth, of the transmutation of time itself. So how would you do that? Well, right now, we might agree we're locked in a certain sense in time. You can't go back and peek into yesterday. Or if you can, you're aware you've got an ability that most people don't. Within a time like the Renaissance, they would also look at it, and a lot of D. and Kelley's writing concerns this, the transmutation of bloodlines, because of the idea that the state of a people will be revealed by who leads them, which we all can just make of that whatever we want. But if you are your own leader, hopefully what they're talking about is actually that in the Renaissance would be what you'd connect to your own spiritual alchemy now. So it was a great way for alchemists who failed to have an excuse, right? It's because they're living in the wrong time. They're living, in fact, that's something John Dee says in the Hieroglyphic Monad, that this is really hard to do now. It was easier in other times. Or blaming the alchemist assistant. Go ahead.
We're quite advanced on the physics of that, in the sense, in the book on the physics of coincidence, article goldenmean.info/coincidence, that we showed that if you plot Planck times the Planck time, you get the sequence of how to arrange events in golden ratio in time. And if you rearrange your rituals, for example, to fit that spiral timeline, they fuse, implode, and charge embed. And that is a transmutation of time, and it is the physics of coincidence, which is simply charge coupling, since time is only charge rotation. And further then, you know, when Bruce Cathy showed that nuclear critical mass depended on placement on alignment on the grid, and the same way that the Ark of the Covenant's ability to reduce radioactivity measurably also depended on its placement on grid lines, just like the labyrinth and the Cozy Rev mirror. So if you arrange the event in both time and space on fractal conjugate lines, and now we can accurately calculate, suddenly it's not just a transmutation or alchemization of time, it's literally the fusion toward a center point, which enables the perfect connectivity. So, you know, alchemization of time is not just a metaphor, it's very accurate physics now, as is the physics of coincidence.
Well, and also when you were talking about that, well, what I call that still center point, and you have if you're doing this in a temple, you have a torus and you have everything sort of going through its center, where what is largest becomes the smallest, and that's the same thing in time. I've had many times in my life where I've had a really strange feeling that some other version of myself in another time was tossing me information. It's an odd feeling, but it makes sense if you don't consider this world all there is.
There's a great section in Jane Roberts' Education of Oversoul 7 where she's saying where soul memories bleed through between lifetimes. Someone is in a cave in South America and there's a carving on the wall that has a grid geometry which is very similar to a carving on the wall of a Gothic cathedral 1,000 years later. And you have two different incarnations of the same soul, and there's a bleed through of memory at that point. So that embeddability creates a geometric connection, which is literally charge implosion. Mm-hmm. So when the geometry is not just symmetric, but implosive, it creates that a possibility of fusion. And remember, time travel is just a name for the fusion of charge rotation. In fact, in physics, time reversal only always means negentropy. So you cannot go back, return something to a past of greater of less order. You cannot time reverse regular steel to rusted steel, but you can time reverse rusted steel to unrusted. So you can only go back or return to something of increased order. So negentropy in physics is the only possible kind of time reversal.
And that involves wave mixing, as you explained so brilliantly other times. I might just go to a point in the life of Dee and Kelley that is much maligned. And I was saddened, actually, that, it's much maligned. This is their so-called wife swapping. Now, the feminist in me wants to say, like, maybe it's spouse swapping, but okay, whatever you want to call it. I wonder why no one seems to look at that in terms of some of the concepts we're talking about. That is, if you look at what is said at that time, first you have Madimi, maybe the Magna Mater, saying that you need to basically don't be as stupid as the common man. You need to come together in unity and learn things. And Dee's good with that. He's like, oh, okay, so we and our wives get together and we all study stuff, right? And we learn how to expand our consciousness. And then Kelley supposedly, he says, and Dee records, that Madimi reveals her shame. Now, of course, what this shows is that person has some issues with women, but that's kind of easy to figure out. And he's like, no, it's carnal. So they go back. And now Dee wants to ask Madimi through Kelley, well, is this just getting together and, the unity of our shared spiritual pursuits and study of knowledge, or is it carnal also? And at that point, Kelley sees this scroll unravel, and in Latin it says, I speak of both. Oh my God, what's going to happen here? Well, the interpretations of that are just stupid, or they're locked in that century because they're never connected to the other things going on, which is it's combining the tables of Enoch, combining the great table. So remember what the great table is supposed to contain. If I can get back to that.
Key to alchemy.
It's the secrets of alchemy.
And just
combining this, I'll just jump to is what Dan talks about is four-wave mixing. On top of it, while all this is going on, Kelley has another vision, which leads to the tables being reordered. He sees these four pillars, and he sees the head of him and his wife and Dee's wife. Well, maybe that's how you separate out the great table. So you turn it into the sides of a cube, so it isn't this flat thing. So did it have to mean that we're going to swap partners? Well, it does mean that everybody's Everybody's energy needs to get in sync. I guess that's one way to do it. If that offends anyone, I'm sorry. A shared meditation would do the same thing, but I am always sort of surprised that that episode isn't understood a little bit better, because if we're talking about four-wave mixing and implosion, and well, the more people that you have in sync with each other, the stronger it's going to be. So that's my little rant about things, and I would argue after that, if you're those of you interested in Enochian, you may know that the records of what Dee and Kelley are doing just break off. Vincent and Alan and I all agreed that the stories you get about why that happened are just bogus. You get a story that it's the famous let's blame the help, right? So somebody's got all of these, and this woman is working, and she's using them to line pie pans. And so by the time they find out, oh my gosh, all the stuff is gone, all the really good stuff, the heptagonal working, in fact, every working after the third working is gone. I would say it's gone because it wasn't safe to keep it around, and this, poor woman cooking pies is blamed for it. But.
Yeah, but I think, back to the pure principle here, to remind people, as Terry's referring to the four-wave mixing that we've talked about so many times. Remember, the first time they arranged lasers to conjugate to produce time reversal in physics, it was basically lasers arranged in a square wave, a cube, basically, and which we call pine cones kissing noses. And so when you conjugate human plasma, there's lots of ways to arrange people to do that. But one of them, of course, is your love relationships. But another example would be the fact that in the Enochian Ophanim, when you invoke the four directions, which is sacred in every ancient tradition, you're doing precisely that. You're sending the magnetic donuts to implode from the four directions to finish the pine cones kissing noses in a cube, which is how phase conjugation happens, which is how you create the implosion through Planck, and therefore access to the superluminal, longitudinal, and all the magic, literally.
Right, and if you don't have a concept of something like a torus or a hypercube, you say, well, that's the divine. There's a famous description of a sphere that's often attributed to Aleister Crowley that actually that goes way back into the to Nicholas of Cusa. That, but I'll leave you to look it up because I'm just blanking on it. But it's from your center you can access anything. Why? Because that's what the divine is. So without a concept of four dimensions, well, you just know that it happens. I mean, then it's pure shamanism, but it works.
And I just like to say that one of my most powerful experiences of that invoking of the alphabet letters, they were Hebrew alphabet letters from the four directions, was when Terry and Alan flew into Turin, and Vincent arrived on virtual video and we had the very advanced Ophanim Enochian study group in Torino, thanks to Kudai, and they invoked those letters, and there was a magnetic wind at center that was so strong that you could blow the doors off a room. I felt that wind, and it was because such a clear and strong, accurate sequence of visualization of the sacred letters from the four directions. Do you remember even what those letters were, Terry?
Sure. I mean, what we did wasn't anything complicated. I mean, it was starting with the pentagram, and those of you who do pentagram rituals, I mean, we went from a lesser to a supreme invoking pentagram. Then we opened the veil and we did some Enochian calls. But the thing is, the energy of the people in the group really ramped everything up. It's like you can open a door, and so if there's no wind out there, you just look out, like, that's nice. With this, you open the door and whoa. Now some other it reminds me of another working years ago with Vincent when we went to Washington DC, which is built on a very interesting part of the grid. But everyone who went to do what we were doing then had a sunburn the next day. And Dan, I understand that happened to you all in Sedona also when you all were out there, that you were up all night and by morning you had a sunburn.
We planned that ritual for a year in the Red Rocks in Sedona, and it was an all-night event. And yeah, it was a turning point of lots of lives that day, actually.
Yeah. Well, I thanks for telling that story, Dan. I think it isn't that. I mean, when you have a few people leading it who have the structure right, and everyone syncs, and by that I mean SYNC, not SINK. Wow. I mean, it's you're steering tornadoes. Yeah, you can create a big storm. You can steer the storm. You can do all kinds of things. You also have to be careful, as Vincent was always want to say, not to confuse the jolt with the insight. You know, that's the sort of, well, I've got a fork and I stick it into an electrical outlet. Whoa, that was strong. It's like, yeah, well, maybe not strong in the right way. So what I think is telling also, after somebody does something like we did in Italy that time, is how much of it can someone retain and reproduce. Usually, I mean, speaking for myself, I couldn't reproduce much. As the years have gone by, I can reproduce more of it. With doing Enoki, and Vincent would often talk about, well, he could be the elevator operator and take everyone on a ride, which is what Alan and I do most of the time. Or if somebody's really into it and they want to build things up themselves and they want to consider that they're building this kind of alchemical installation, that's a lot harder to do, but that's way more rewarding. I mean, it's
and it's so common that people complain about the fact that our big tornadoes are unsteered, but very few people are willing to develop their aura to a point where they can steer tornadoes of that size and the responsibility required. There are actually many groups who do a form of meditation and prayer who really feel that they do steer some larger storms, but actually connect the technical wave mechanics. And by the way, Alan's clairvoyance for really assembling these etheric structures is fabulous. And if you connect that, now that not only do we have the emotional ability, but we have the technical ability to steer our larger storms. But as we've said so many times, it's not just a matter of knowing you can build an aura big enough to steer a storm and eventually a star, but it's also a matter of understanding that, you know, you now realize what causes the tornado to feel pain, so that you can feel the pain of the tornado, which is obviously where charge is bleeding due to where we've broken the grid and we've put metal buildings and those things which any plasma toroid would feel as pain, which is simply charge bleeding, which is why obviously tornadoes kill metal trailer parks and always save the stone temple. It's very well known. We now know the physics. So suddenly it means we have to take responsibility for every magnetic line we've cut in our lives. So there's many things to take responsibility for before we complain about that our tornadoes are out of control.
And many things to feel blessed by. I'll tell you our tornado story. Here in Platteville, we were hit by some pretty awful tornadoes a few years back. No one understood why there was only one person seriously injured. It should have wiped out a bunch of people. Thankfully, it didn't. But Alan and I live right in the direct path. The tornado came through, wiped out things very close to us, hopped over where we lived to the university, knocked out the lights in part of the football stadium and a bunch of houses right after that. So that morning when we walked around and realized, wow, nothing happened here. I'd planted little cucumbers and they were still out there in their little, cucumber pots. And there was just devastation coming towards us and after us. Are you feeling blessed? I felt pretty blessed.
Are you saying that tornadoes experience football as pain?
Yep. Testosterone poisoning, I think is how you put it, right? Yeah, I mean, they obviously, they were like, well, the heck, we're going to wipe the lights out of this stadium. It was impressive in a horrible kind of way.
Where is the academic who actually did the study on what tornadoes walked around to save versus what they walked around to destroy? We could actually prove statistically that tornadoes experience metal structures as pain. We could prove it.
If you're the she certainly do. Fairies don't like metal. You want them to all run away? Go, have a piece of metal in your pocket and go into a sacred circle in the woods. They'll all leave.
Yeah, you called it the she,
Yeah, the shining ones or the
shining ones. Yes, exactly. And in fact, they say that one of the fastest ways to kill an elemental is put an aluminum stake in the ground or something like
yeah.
that. And we know exactly the dielectric reason why, geopathic metal structures kill negative ions and kill the plasma from Therify and kill elementals, because charge propagation is not possible there. So eventually we can make an environment in which tornadoes feel love.
Well, I love it. I've reached an end of what I was going to say here, by the way, and I know our time is about out. So I just, I'm happy to answer any questions, but the problem is I can't see them anymore. So if
Well,
there's
there was one mention about that the alchemy was not just recipes, but it was an engine, as Brian said, which
yeah,
is true.
yeah.
These recipes
See,
were engines.
Brian is sort of subversive. He's been in on this stuff since about 2001. He just always kind of hides in the background.
and also mentioned that when we refer to the angelics, we refer to the cherubim. That was one comment. And then when we were talking about the ritual there, Shelley said, "Let's do it again. Let's
Yeah.
plan more planetary rituals." That was another comment, which is thank
Well,
you, Shelley.
we're gonna have one coming up that ought to be pretty awesome. But I'd say it's about as good of a party as you'll ever have. So I'm
Yes,
on.
and so actually we are planning a global Therify plasma meditation as part of the June Breakthrough Technologies Therify conference here, fractalfield.com/2018. And gradually, as more of us feel ready for these global meditations, if we can actually, gather our intent, we know the plasma physics. All we have to do is assemble ourselves. So with that, I think we really want to thank you so much, Teresa, for bringing all this together. And we're going to make this shareable in the next day or two, the film. And the conversation's just beginning. If those of us who can join us here in South France in June, or at fractalu.com, we have much more coming. And remember to get Terry's book about Vincent coming. How do people get your...
It's Vincent's book. That's great. I will. Well, it should show up on Amazon. Not this coming Tuesday, but the Tuesday after. So you can get it there, but you can get it a lot more cheaply if you just, because Amazon has like a 55% markup. So if you're in Prague, just buy it in Prague, or if you are in Turkey, or if you're in the south of France, because I'm going to bring some, and then it'll be about half the cost. Otherwise, I will have a link on our Facebook group, and it'll just be on Amazon.
And say again the name of the book, just one more time for the
An
closing.
Alchemical Enigma, a short history of the rise and fall of Sir Edward Kelley.
Well, thank you very much, Terry. Thanks to Alan. Thanks to Terry. Thanks to everybody. Blessings. Stay in touch with us. And remember, we're going to do this Global Bliss project. It's coming. We're getting the pieces together.
Thanks, Dan.
Blessings. See you all guys soon. Blessings. Good night.